It is a wonderful honor to be joined by Jonathan Ike. He is a journalist and a biographer. And today we're discussing his wonderful new biography of Martin Luther King Jr. John, welcome to the show. How are you?
I'm good, Chun. Thanks. How are you?
I'm doing very well. So I originally scheduled this one in or around Martin Luther King Day, Jr. Day, but since you were busy, we pushed it back to April. So may I ask, how did you spend Martin Luther King Day this year?
Oh, on the actual day, I was at a school in Chicago. I was busy all that week, speaking at universities and at some government centers. But on the actual day, I was at a middle school in Chicago. It was actually the Martin Luther King Jr. Middle School in Chicago, so it seemed like an appropriate place to be that day.
Well, so given the day is only what 3 months ago as of this recording, how would you reflect on the contests behind or about the legacy of Martin Luther King Jr. today in our politics?
Well, it's interesting that you started by asking about the holiday because I think the holiday has had a mixed impact. In some ways, it's been a great celebration of King's life, and it's important that we celebrate Black historical figures. There are no other national holidays. There are no other national monuments for people of color in America. But the holiday has also had the effect of watering down some of King's work. We tend to celebrate the parts of his philosophy that make us most comfortable. I have a dream, and let's judge people by the content of their character, not the color of their skin. And we forget that King was a radical. We forget that he was so religious. We forget that our government persecuted him. The same government that honors him now was surveilling him and really trying to destroy him and his movement. So I think the national holiday has been a mixed bag.
Yes. So following up on that, what are some of the key things about King's life as well as his philosophy that is either rarely or not discussed at all in our current American political discourse?
There are a lot of things. One is clearly that he was a radical all along. People tend to say King got radical in the last years of his life, but I think it was there all along. And I think you can see it even in the 1950s when he's traveling to raise money for the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. When he goes to New York, when he goes to Chicago, when he goes to Los Angeles, he says, by the way, I'm coming back because you got problems here too. The North is just as racist in many ways as the South. You're just camouflaging it better, and he's speaking out on things like materialism and militarism. We just tend to pay more attention to it in the last years of his life. So I wanted to remind people about King's radicalism. I also felt like it was important to remind people that his radicalism was rooted in his Christianity, that it all came from his belief in the principles of Jesus, and that he would be hypocritical if he didn't call out militarism, if he didn't call out violence and racism in the North, because his work as an activist was really just an extension of his ministry. And again, sometimes we're not comfortable talking about religion, especially when it comes in interaction with politics.
I suppose the reason why King has become de-radicalized, so to speak, is he is often compared to Malcolm X, who most Americans see as, I guess, proposing a more radical course of action in regards to race politics. And I wonder if this comparison between King and X is at all fair.
I think it's been oversimplified. I think they were both calling for a radical new approach to the fight for Black dignity. And of course, Martin Luther King stressed nonviolence, and Malcolm X said that violence might be necessary if demands were not met. And on that front, they disagreed. But if you look at their lives, you see that they're really coming together. You see that they have a lot more in common. And you see that really the media was trying to drive them apart. One of the things I discovered in my research was that this quote that Playboy magazine printed from King when asked about Malcolm X was entirely fabricated by the magazine. They asked him what he thought about Malcolm X, and they printed this response in which King was supposedly saying that he thought Malcolm's fiery oratory brought nothing but grief to Black Americans. And King never said that. The magazine completely changed his words. So it's another example of how the white media and how the government was trying to divide and conquer the civil rights leaders. And they did a very good job of that, unfortunately.
Yes. What was King's reception within the civil rights activism circle?
It was mixed. He was certainly, especially early on, seen as this great hope, somebody who could really deliver this message across racial lines, across geographic lines. He spoke to the entire nation, Black and white, North and South, and that was very exciting. And especially in the early years, that's why you see people flocking to Montgomery and trying to get him to take this movement national. But of course, as he becomes the focus of attention, there's jealousy, there's bitterness, and then there's younger activists who are suddenly feeling like King isn't pushing fast enough, isn't pushing hard enough, that he's too conservative. They start calling him, an old fuddy-duddy, the Lord, they call him. And Stokely Carmichael and Malcolm X kind of, push their own agendas and do that by contrasting it with King, by saying that they're much more radical and more in touch with the frustrations of Black people than King. But King balances all that. And one of the things that I really admire about him is that he never fights back against those critics, and he talks to them and he learns from them, and he seems like he's willing to listen, and he works with almost everybody. He offers to help these younger activists, even if they're the same ones who are often criticizing him.
Right. Since you mentioned Carmichael, I believe in one of his speeches, King denounces the idea of Black power. He says that it is no better than white power. So to the extent that he knows of Stokely Carmichael's activities, what did King think of that?
Yeah, he resisted the term Black power because he thought it connoted violence, and that he was obviously opposed to violence of all kinds. But what's interesting is that he and Stokely Carmichael really debated. They marched together through Mississippi in 1966, and they have these great discussions about it. And as a result, I think you see Martin Luther King influencing Stokely Carmichael, and you see Carmichael influencing King. You see King starting to use the word power a lot more, economic power, the power of justice, the power of love. And you see him even saying Black more than Negro. His vocabulary is starting to change. He's adapting. He's learning from these people who criticize him. And I think that's another sign of how he, just continued to grow throughout his all too short life and career.
I've heard that in one of his last remarks before he was assassinated, King said that, I think it was to Harry Belafonte, "I'm afraid I've integrated our people," I mean, by that he means Black people, "into a burning house." What do you make of that remark?
Well, it's certainly understandable. And if you look at what happened after his assassination, it certainly looked like a burning house. The cities went up in flames in protest about his death. And the government responded to that mostly with law enforcement, with incarceration. And we continue to live with that legacy of responding to the problems of the Black community by jailing, by putting more and more people behind bars. And King felt like the moment of hope that he witnessed, that he helped usher in 1963 at the March on Washington, had passed, and that there had been this tremendous backlash, this anger, this hostility toward giving equal rights to Black people. And I think we're still seeing that today. Every time we make progress, there's a backlash. The election of Barack Obama leads to the election of Donald Trump, and I think that's in large part because there's this feeling of anger that these people have gone too far, they've asked for too much, and that continues to haunt us today. I think that's what King was referring to.
And speaking of backlash, give us an overview of who James Earl Ray was, other than the fact that he was the assassin of King.
Yeah, James Earl Ray was a loner, a very strange and mysterious figure who, had a few brushes with the law here and there, and had escaped from jail at one point, and managed to continue to elude capture for a long time. And nobody really knows or understands completely why he decided to target Martin Luther King. And that's one of the reasons why some people think that this must have been a conspiracy, because he's such an odd figure and seems to come out of nowhere in his wrath and his determination to kill King. But he stalks him across the country and catches up with him in Memphis, and then after the assassination, escapes for quite a while and manages to elude capture yet again. So very unusual. And there are still people in the King family who believe that he did not even pull the trigger, that someone else may have completely carried out this, and perhaps with the assistance of the government. I don't have any comment on that. I think there hasn't been any solid evidence presented one way or the other so far, but it's intriguing and it's sad, and I think the ultimate truth is that whether James Earl Ray acted alone or not, the government created the conditions that would make someone want to assassinate this great moral leader, and that to me is the great tragedy.
Tell us about the immediate reaction across America upon hearing of King's assassination.
Well, first of all, even before King was pronounced dead, the news reached J. Edgar Hoover at the FBI headquarters, and his response was, "I hope the bastard doesn't die because they'll make a martyr out of him." And when King died shortly thereafter, great waves of shock spread across the country, and especially in Black communities, and there was violence. Cities were on fire, and police moved in to try to control the violence, the looting, and it felt like, I know to a lot of people I interviewed, it felt like the nation was coming apart, and that the grief and the anger were too great to be contained. And as I said earlier, the response to that from our government, from our federal government at the highest levels, was not, let's commit ourselves to fulfilling King's dream. The response was, let's arrest those people, and let's increase policing in the cities. Let's further sentencing for violent crimes, and that's the legacy, really, unfortunately, of the King assassination.
Mm-hmm. Of course, speaking of FBI Director Hoover, I believe around the same time that your biography of King's was published, there's a great biography of Hoover was published too by Yale professor Beverly Gage. Hoover is, of course, a very fascinating figure, and there's a lot to focus on him, but let's focus on his actions taken against King. So from what I've heard, Hoover suspected that King was either a communist or has communist allies within the movement, and he launched the wiretap operation, and he discovered something perhaps even worse, that King was a womanizer. So first, I want to ask whether the tapes that Hoover obtained, to what extent do they still remain classified?
The tapes have been released. The transcripts of the tapes have been released. Most of them, not all of them. And the tapes themselves, the audio, is scheduled to be released in 2027. So we have a very good picture of what the FBI was picking up from its surveillance of King. We don't have all of it, and there's still some concerns, some mysteries, some holes to be filled. But the most important thing we know is that the FBI quickly concluded that he was not engaged in any kind of communist activity, and they became obsessed with his personal life, mostly because they saw that as a tool they could use, a weapon they could use to try to undermine his work. And J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI perceived King as a threat to the status quo. They perceived him as a threat to the white power structure because he might actually unite people in a movement for change. And that's what they were afraid of. It's not that they were afraid he was going to topple the government. They were afraid he was going to force the people hoarding power to share some of it. And that became Hoover's obsession. And that's an obsession rooted in racism, to be sure. And it's an obsession that was not unique to J. Edgar Hoover, because members of Congress, presidents, including obviously LBJ, but also JFK, were complicit in this. They knew about it. They at times encouraged it, and could have stopped it, but chose not to.
Yes, of course. I know that Bobby Kennedy, who was Attorney General at that time, he publicly met with King and I guess publicly declared his support for King, but behind the scenes he was ordering the wiretap operation to well, to continue. So tell us about the the government. By this, I mean the Kennedy and Johnson's administrations. What their attitude towards King was.
It was complicated. I think they saw him as a great ally, somebody who could help rally support for the civil rights legislation that they were putting forward. But at the same time, they saw him as a threat to the status quo and somebody they couldn't completely trust. Obviously, Robert F. Kennedy signs the authorization of the wiretaps, and that continues. That's reauthorized even after they discover that he's not interested in communism. And of course, LBJ reauthorizes it. And when one of his attorneys, when the acting attorney general comes to him and says, "Do you know about this?" LBJ acts as if he's shocked, but of course he knew about it all along, and he's encouraging it. At one point, the White House even encourages the FBI to leak the King tapes to the media. So the president, Johnson is in particular is a great partner with King in pushing for new legislation and pushing for important new policies and programs. But at the same time, he's gossiping behind his back and undercutting him with not just members of the FBI, but with the members of the media, with other politicians. So it's just another sign of how difficult King's work really was.
I'd like you to comment on the poison pen letter, as is now known. The story goes that after a significant number of hours of tapes have been obtained, these tapes were sent to King, and this was before he was to come to Stockholm to accept the Nobel Peace Prize. And there was a letter purportedly written by a disgruntled or disillusioned ex-follower of King. It was, I think it ends with "you know what to do." So it implies that for the tapes not to leak to the public, he should commit suicide. So how did King react to this?
Well, you described it accurately. The FBI took these clips from his scenes from his hotel room, mailed it to his office. The package was delivered from his office to his home. Coretta heard it, and King, when he heard it, called Ralph Abernathy and said, "You got to come over and listen to this." I think that some of this sounds like it's from the Willard Hotel. He recognized it, and immediately knew that it must have been sent by the FBI and not from some disgruntled, former ally. And he dispatched some of his top advisors to go meet with J. Edgar Hoover, and nothing came of the meeting. It was completely unproductive. So King knew that he was a target. He knew that J. Edgar Hoover was obsessed with him, and he knew that this could be used to undermine his work. And the extraordinary thing to me is that, he kept going, because I think a lot of people would have quit and just said, it's not worth it, and I can't be effective under these conditions. But King kept going, and in fact, doubled down. He criticized J. Edgar Hoover publicly. He began speaking out more aggressively on Northern racism and on the Vietnam War, things that he knew would further anger LBJ. So it's a sign of his incredible commitment that he was willing to persevere under these kinds of conditions with his own government seeking to destroy him.
Yes. So, notwithstanding the fact that these tapes were recorded and obtained illegally, we do know that Martin Luther King, who was an exemplary moral leader, engaged in, I guess, infidelities and adultery, which are immoral acts. How do you propose to reckon with this?
I think we reckon with it just by speaking the truth and by acknowledging that people are flawed. Most of us, all of us, have some flaws, and King's were more visible because he was under so much scrutiny. But and he wrestled with it himself. He preached about this Jekyll and Hyde personality, the fact that we all have things we regret, that we're not perfect. But the important thing to do is is to do the work and to try to be better and to try to, live the best life you can. And I think it's important that we acknowledge that our heroes are flawed. I think it doesn't make them less heroic. It makes them more heroic in a way, because they're overcoming not just the external challenges, but the internal challenges as well.
Yes. I think as a Christian and reading through the Old Testament, I understand the fact that great figures, even great prophets, can be tremendously flawed people. So, tell me about how King's Christianity influences his philosophy as well as his activism.
I think Christianity is at the root of everything he does. I think it's his North Star. It's his guiding light. It's everything. And it goes back to his father and his grandfather. It goes back to when the family had been enslaved, and when Christianity was the hope of a better future. Even though this was a religion given to the slaves in an attempt to try to control them, it was something that they found inspiration in, because if the Bible said that all men were created equal, if all men were created in the image of God, then those words must be true. And that it became the responsibility of people like King and his father and grandfather to work through the church to make those words true. And that's really the heart of the Black social gospel, the idea that we have a responsibility to bring the world into line with the words of the Bible, with the promise of the Bible. And that becomes King's you know center. It keeps him going in times of doubt. It's why he feels like he has to step up and take responsibility when, in Montgomery, he's not even sure he wants to be um, leading anything, but he feels like he has to, because this is what the Bible says we have to do. And I think we see it over and over again, that he returns to these principles when times are tough, when he has doubts, when he fails. The Bible just continues to give him the strength to go forward.
Yes. We've mentioned James Earl Ray. So, why don't you give us an overview of either the threats of violence and the attempts of violence against King's life before he.
It was a constant in his life. As soon as he begins to lead the Montgomery bus boycott, and he's only 26 years old when that boycott begins, his home is bombed. His wife and baby are inside the house. They're not hurt, thank God. And then the windows are shot out of his house. He's stabbed in the chest by a woman in Harlem. He's receiving constant death threats, and don't forget, every time he's arrested, that's a hugely frightening ordeal, because Black people disappear in prison all the time and never come out, and he had to face that possibility as well. So he lived with this. He lived with constant death threats, and with the knowledge that that he was probably not going to live a long life. And he talks about it. He talks about it toward the end of his life over and over again. His friends said he became obsessed with death. And if you look at his last speech, the one he gave at Mason Temple the night before he died, he talks about death constantly in that speech, and says, he'd like to live a long life, but that doesn't matter, because he just wants to do God's will. And he doesn't think he's going to be there to see it, but he believes that, that the Black people will reach the promised land. And it's understandable. It's not paranoid at this point for him to think that his life is going to be cut short.
And that would be the "I've been to the mountaintop" speech, right?
That's right.
Yes. I'd like to focus on two of King's big proposed concerns before his tragic death. One is the Poor People's Campaign. He wishes to mobilize poor people across all races, and in some ways challenge the economic structure at that time. So, would you like to provide us with more details regarding his mission?
Right. By 1967, King was really unpopular in America. We forget that now. 2/3 of Americans said they disapproved of King. And that was in part because he was speaking out more on issues that they thought were, outside his bailiwick. He was talking about poverty. He was talking about Northern racism. He was talking about the war in Vietnam. And that cost him a lot of support. But instead of retreating and focusing just on voting rights, where he could have played it safe, he decided to start planning his most ambitious campaign, really, and he called it the Poor People's Campaign. They were going to essentially occupy Washington, D.C. Thousands of people were going to camp out on public lands, and they were going to refuse to leave until the government agreed to make fundamental changes in the system, in capitalism, really, in the American style of capitalism. King wanted to see guaranteed jobs and guaranteed income and health care and child care. And this further frightened the federal government, further infuriated J. Edgar Hoover. And King was having a hard time even pulling it together. His powers were diminished. He wasn't able to, and he complained about this all the time. People aren't listening to me anymore. Why aren't they responding to this? And we know this because the FBI was surveilling him, and we can read the transcripts of his calls. And he was having a hard time pulling it off, and it was not clear that it was going to work at all. And even some of his closest friends and advisors were saying, "This is going to be a disaster. Don't do it." But he felt once again that he had to respond to this call, that he had to help the poor and the disenfranchised. He had to speak out on these issues that were, at the core of his faith.
Mhm. Give us an overview of King's economic views. So I think I've read somewhere that he was against communism, but of course he was displeased with capitalism, the way Americans tend to view it.
He was, when he was young, he was interested in communism, but he found that it lacked, it certainly didn't allow for his religious faith, and that it had limitations, and in practice never really lived up to its potential. And he grew and evolved over time, and I think he was leaning toward a more of a sort of a democratic socialism by the time he was assassinated. I think he imagined that we might embrace some of the policies of Scandinavian countries and just have a much greater safety net, higher taxes, and take care of the poor a lot better than we were doing. I think that was really the direction he was going.
Yeah. Onto his opposition against the Vietnam War. I wonder, his was his stance based more on moral grounds or on racial grounds, as in more young black men yeah, in the proportionally are drafted into the war than, say, whites?
I think it was definitely both, and I think in some ways it began more with concern about the fact that black soldiers were being drafted in disproportionate numbers and being killed in disproportionate numbers, being placed in the front lines, especially early in the war. But the more he studied it and the more he engaged on the subject, the more he began to feel sympathy and empathy with the Vietnamese who were dying too. And at one point he was traveling, and in the airport he picked up a copy of a magazine that had just gruesome photos of the Vietnamese victims of the war, and that had a huge impact on King. He began to feel like it wasn't enough to focus just on the Black Americans who were dying, but the Vietnamese were his brothers too. That we were all children of God, and that violence anywhere was an offense to his faith, and that's why he began. And in his most famous speech on the subject, the Beyond Vietnam speech on April 4th, 1967, at Riverside Church, he says this quite clearly, that there's no difference in the eyes of God between the Vietnamese who are dying and the Americans who are dying, and that he has to speak up for both of them to end this, to call for the end of this war.
That's so I'd like to ask, in regards to your researching and writing this biography, I wonder, during the research and writing process, what are some of the new primary sources that were available for you to access and use?
Oh, there were so many. To begin with, I interviewed hundreds of people who knew King and who worked with him. That's some of my favorite primary sources. But I also found new tapes that had never been heard before from Coretta that she made while she was working on her first book in 1968. I found the archival collection of Lawrence Dunbar Reddick, who was King's full-time archivist, basically the official archivist of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. And thousands and thousands of his pages were at the Schomburg Center in Harlem, and the boxes had never been opened until I came along. I found the papers that LBJ kept in his secretary's safe, and it included hundreds of pages of letters from J. Edgar Hoover directly to the president. That's just the scratching the surface. I found Martin Luther King Sr.'s unpublished memoirs, including transcripts of tapes he made while he was working on those memoirs. And again, I'm the first writer to have access to those. So it's kind of amazing that for someone so well known and so well documented for King, that there was still available so much new research and so much new material.
So how much did Martin Luther King Sr. influence his son?
Oh, hugely. I think he's one of the most interesting characters. I think, Martin Luther King Sr. and Coretta Scott King are two characters who have not really been given their historical due. And Daddy King, as everybody called Sr., was just an incredibly courageous man. I mean, he's like a figure out of a fictional work. He's, born into sharecropping. He's virtually illiterate, and he just picks up and walks out of Stockbridge, Georgia, and makes his way to Atlanta and reinvents himself, learns to read and write, learns to preach, marries into this other family, and makes it possible to raise a kid like Martin Luther King Jr. Of course, his name is Mike King when he's born. He's not Martin Luther King. The father and son both changed their names as another sign of just how ambitious they were and how much they hoped to achieve in life.
Yes. So tell us about how Martin Luther, the Protestant reformer, is positioned as an influence to both of them.
I think they took a lot of pride in the fact that they were named after this reformer, someone who, risked everything to stand up for what he believed in. And it was Daddy King who, when traveling to Germany in 1934, learned more about Martin Luther and came home impressed and decided to take his name and also to bestow it on his son. And I think it's a great sign of just how ambitious and how much protest was at the center of their existence, even before the civil rights movement, as we know it, began. I think protest was just at the core of what it meant to be a Black preacher in the South at that time.
And tell us about Coretta Scott's historical and personal role as King's wife.
She's again, hugely influential figure, and I think the reason King falls in love with her and decides to marry her is because she's an activist. He's dated a lot of women, a lot of smart, beautiful women, but Coretta's the one who has experience in activism. And when they meet, actually, she has more experience than he does because she's been to an integrated college, Antioch in Ohio, and she's been involved in student protests. And when she starts talking to King, he's excited about that. And she's the one recommending books that he needs to read. She's the one asking, how are you going to fight Jim Crow? And when they get married, she's the one who's always pushing him to think beyond civil rights and to talk about Vietnam. And when he wins the Nobel Prize, to think about how they can get more involved in international issues. So I think she is more than just the woman behind the man. Sometimes she's the woman in front of the man, leading the way.
To what extent, while King was alive, did she know of his marital infidelities?
Well, she claimed that she did not believe that he ever cheated on her, but I think she had to know. I think it's almost impossible to imagine that she was not aware. In fact, she caught him cheating before they were even married. In fact, that's one of the things that was revealed on these tapes that I discovered. She tells the story of when they were engaged, catching him with a former girlfriend, and she decided that she could live with that. She had to accept it. So I think she accepted it early on and continued to accept it over and over, not happily, but she understood her own importance. She understood how much she was needed, how much influence she could have, not just in the family, but on the world, and that she was willing to make that sacrifice.
Of course, King is best known for his speeches. So how did he describe to us his training as an orator?
Well, he grew up in the church, of course, and he heard his father preaching all the time, and he didn't really care for his father's style of preaching. It was too emotional, too country for him. but he also got to hear lots of other preachers in Atlanta, and he could compare and contrast them. And he listened to the preachers on the radio, including white preachers, and he sort of, took it all in, soaked it in, and found his own style. And of course, went to college and studied philosophy, and went to seminary and studied more philosophy, and went to Boston University for his doctorate, studied, theology and philosophy. So all of that begins to inform his style. He embraces a much more intellectual, grandiose style of preaching, but he still has at his core this great country preaching style. He knows how to connect with Black audiences. He knows how to connect with the poor, with the less literate. But he's not afraid to throw in some Socrates and some other philosophers, and and I think the audiences really respond because he's not talking down to anybody. He's speaking in a way that has this incredibly broad appeal, Black and white, educated, non-educated. His voice touches everybody.
Tell us about the civil rights movement before King and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference.
Well, before King, the civil rights movement was fairly scattered. You had the NAACP doing all this great legal work, but you didn't have a grassroots movement yet. You had churches providing leadership, but King's great contribution, I think, was creating a focus for the movement, a symbol, somebody who became the face of the movement, and who, by leading churches and by uniting churches in his organization, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, began to build this web that spread across the country and inspired movements. So we have the bus boycotts, and that people see that and they begin starting their own local protests. So that's where the people who are doing the lunch counter sit-ins have been inspired by the Montgomery bus boycotts. The people who are leading the freedom rides have been inspired by the Montgomery bus boycotts. And then King can help connect all of these various movements, sometimes by showing up, sometimes by just talking about them. And he becomes, in many ways, sort of like the president of the Black community. He's speaking for the people, and sometimes that's difficult because you can't please everybody, and he's too radical for some and too conservative for others. But nevertheless, he embraces this role as the sort of the unifier, the voice who speaks for the people.
Now, one of his great pieces of writing is the letter from a Birmingham jail. So tell us about the circumstances that led him into that jail cell.
Well, King always knew that he got more attention when he was in jail, and he hated going to jail. It was terrifying, but he knew that the media paid attention to him more, and that they paid attention to the movement more when he was suffering. So when he got to jail in Birmingham, he opened up the local newspaper and saw printed in the paper a letter from a group of religious leaders, mostly Christian, one rabbi as well, saying, Dr. King, we support you, but we think you're asking for too much too soon. If you would just give us time and trust our white brothers to work with us, we think we can get more done. And King was just infuriated by that. I mean, nothing angered him more than religious leaders telling him to slow down. And he, in response, began writing on newspaper scraps and sandwich wrappers, a response to these ministers, saying, how dare you suggest that we wait? How dare you ask us to continue suffering while we wait for our oppressors to give us justice? The time for justice is now. The time for justice is always now, and we won't be told to wait. And that produces one of the greatest manifestos in American history. It's, perhaps King's greatest piece of writing.
Yes, in that letter is where the quote, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere, correct?
That's right.
Now, to what extent was Martin Luther King's philosophy of nonviolent action influenced by Gandhi's action in India?
I think it was hugely influenced. King, of course, learns about nonviolence first from Jesus, and then begins to study it in college and reads Thoreau and others. And while in seminary, he attends a lecture about Gandhi and comes away really moved and goes out and buys a bunch of books on Gandhi. And so he becomes a student, but it's not until he's thrust into this situation in Montgomery where he's threatened with violence that he has to really think about how to apply this in his life. And when the boycotts begin in Montgomery and his home is bombed, his initial reaction is to go out and buy a gun. And it's only when Bayard Rustin comes to town and says, you know, if you're serious about nonviolence, you got to get rid of the gun. And King agrees that it's at that point that he really begins to think about nonviolence as a philosophy, not just as a strategy. And he sees that it's very effective in Montgomery. He sees that, as Howard Thurman writes in Jesus and the Disinherited, that the use of nonviolence can disarm your opponent. It can give you the moral superiority. So they may have more power, but you now have the higher moral power. And that becomes a hugely important part of King's crusade for the rest of his life, really.
I'm glad you mentioned Rustin. I know that there's a recent movie out on Netflix right now. Um, a, a little known piece of writing that King authored is a response to a letter from, I believe, one of his followers. He says that he was struggling with feelings of homosexuality, and King's response was essentially, to seek help in regards to that. And of course, this is where I guess the allegations of King's homophobia comes in, and of course, Rustin was himself a gay man. So I wonder, to what extent did he know of Rustin's sexual romantic orientation?
Oh, he certainly knew about it. I think everybody knew about it. And King was not great, was not good at all, really, when it came to accepting homosexuality. He was also weak on women's rights. You know, it's disappointing that one of our great activists for equality had these blind spots, but you know, he was also a product of his times, and that was the general view that, you know, women's roles were to stay home and raise the kids, and that homosexuality was a sin and a crime, and that, you know, that's why when this young man writes to him and says, what should I do? King says, get help, you know, seek counseling. He doesn't support the young man's feelings in any way. And, you know, but on the other hand, King understood that Rustin was a valuable contributor and a trusted advisor and a good friend. And so at least it didn't, you know, his biases didn't blind him from accepting Rustin as a person and as a contributor.
Tell us about the organizational process that would culminate in the March on Washington.
Well, it was a huge challenge to bring, you know, hundreds of thousands of people to Washington, and to do it peacefully, and to provide water and bathrooms, and just to get everybody there. Remember, there's no internet yet, so they just, you know, they had to send thousands of letters to churches and to civic organizations. They had to work the phones. They had to try to get the trains to put on extra runs. And it's a miracle, really. And Bayard Rustin deserves a lot of that credit for pulling off the logistics behind it. And the federal government helped too, even though Kennedy was opposed to the march at first. Once he saw that it was going to happen, you know, he dedicated some resources to making sure that it went smoothly. Because if this thing ended in violence, you know, it would have been a huge setback, and that's really what Kennedy was afraid of.
Yes. So we've talked about the letter from a Birmingham jail. So from King's perspective, why did the
Oh, I'm sorry.
yeah. So my question was, from King's perspective, why were the white church leaders hesitant to take action to address racism, despite the fact that they share his faith?
I think he was, you know, as I said, really frustrated by that they couldn't see things the way he did. But I think he felt like they were just scared. They were afraid of change, and that they were afraid of what they might lose, that they might have to give up some of their authority for others to share in the bounty of American society. And he thought they were just limited in their view, and that they were, hypocritical in their in preaching the words of the Bible while not living up to them.
And I suppose that would be his same feelings on the United States as a whole, his promise of liberty and equality.
Yeah, he felt like, and he said this in his very first speech from Montgomery, that it may be that the people who've been treated worst in this country are the ones who are going to teach America how to fulfill the promises, the empty promises that were made in the founding documents, and that they would prove how much they loved America by how much they were willing to sacrifice, how much they'd already sacrificed, and how much they were willing to continue to sacrifice to make the democracy work for everyone. And that was it's an incredibly generous, optimistic, patriotic statement, and that made it hard for people to dismiss out of hand, which was a big part of, I think, why he was so effective.
What was King's dream?
Oh, his dream was a land of harmony, a world without war, a world without hunger, where we realized that we were all God's children, created equally, that these distinctions that we make based on nationality and color are human constructions and not the way God intended us to live. So, when he talked about these sort of idealistic images of black and white children holding hands and singing in harmony and judging one another by the content of their character, not the color of their skin. That was, it sounded naive. It sounded idealistic, but he meant it. He thought that we were capable of living that way.
So, in that sense, was King optimistic or pessimistic about human nature, black or white?
Oh man, he never lost hope. That's the amazing thing. He's arrested 29 times. His home is bombed. He's stabbed in the chest. His own government is trying to kill him and destroy him. And he never lost hope. He kept saying right until the very end that, things may seem dark. And he was depressed. He was as troubled as anybody, but he said, we must never lose infinite hope. We must stay awake to change. We must continue to fight for justice wherever it must be fought for. And he never quit. He only kept going even when times were dark. So I think that he remained an optimist.
So you've made a tremendous effort in the biography in articulating the humanness of King. And I wonder, to what extent does that help us to, I guess, respect and admire more as a person?
I thought it was very important to try to humanize him, to remind people that, he suffered from issues with mental health. He attempted suicide twice as a teenager. He chewed his fingernails. He had trouble sleeping. I wanted us to remember that our heroes are people that, especially after you create a monument, after you create a national holiday, it's easy to forget that he's a person. And I don't think that we can expect anybody to risk anything if perfection is required for heroism, or if perfection is even required for trying to live up to the words that you believe in. And I really thought it was important to remind people that King was just a man, not a saint, not a symbol. And I hope that people connect with him more and see him as more courageous, more heroic when they see him as human.
Of course, your book is guaranteed to be a vital contribution to the debate, the contest behind King's legacy. And I would imagine that those who are more optimistic about the future of race relations in America will take from it the optimistic part of King's ideas, and the pessimistic part will be appealing to the pessimists. So from your perspective, how do you see the contest behind King's legacy will continue from years on?
Well, I think that I asked a lot of King's friends and civil rights activists what they thought of King's legacy. Did he make a difference? Are we better off today than we were 50 years ago? And they insisted over and over again that we have made tremendous strides, that we still have a lot of challenges, and police brutality and mass incarceration and poverty and segregation remain hugely troubling issues, but that we are much better off today, and that we are making progress, and that we can continue to make progress if we remember King's story and not just water it down and take the parts that make us comfortable. So I like to think that in telling King's story again, we can continue to use his words to get us where we need to go and to continue to make progress on these troubling issues.
Mhm. Now, I wonder, in order to address these issues, which are still like divisive factors regarding race and class and otherwise, do we need a figure of Kings's charisma and stature and I guess intellect and spirituality, or is it possible to form a multiracial and multi-class coalition to address it?
Both would be good. I think that it's hard to imagine anybody having the kind of impact that King had, because we're so divided, and even how we get our news is so divided. It's very hard to find one person who can speak to the masses and that everybody would even consider listening to. Um, I can't think of anybody in the world right now who has that kind of a broad appeal. But the advantage is that we can reach a lot more people a lot more quickly, and that the new age of information and the new forms of media make it easier to spread a message around the world much more quickly. So I hope that maybe we can take advantage of that, but it's not clear how. I think it's something that concerns me and concerns a lot of people, that um, in being so divided and being so self-absorbed in our current universe, that no one's willing to sacrifice, no one's willing to work together toward the common good. But I hope I'm just being cynical, and that there is still hope for change and hope for progress.
To what extent is King's legacy influential outside of America?
Oh, it's hugely influential. I think he inspires movements everywhere. I think that so much of the way we organize protests everywhere, from America to South Africa to China, is based on the model that King provided. That getting numbers, getting people together to march, sending a message, shining a light on injustice, um, demanding that people consider their consciences, forcing people to look injustice in the face. These are things that King did that really inspire protesters everywhere today. I think if you look at almost any significant movement of the last 50 years, you can see how it was influenced by the work of King and the other civil rights activists of the 1960s.
Now, final question, and I think it would be a big one. It starts with if King were alive today. So, um,
Mm.
what would be the first issue on his mind?
Wow, it's hard to say. Would it be war? Would it be poverty? Would it be um, police brutality? These are all things he talked about. Would it be voting rights? All the things that he talked about are still in play today. So it's possible that he would give the same sermon that he planned to give on the Sunday after he was assassinated. Had he been in Atlanta for that sermon, his sermon would have been entitled "America May Go to Hell," and that's how he felt, that we were on the brink, and that these are the things that concerned him then. And I suspect, sadly, that many of the same concerns would be at the top of his list now.
I wonder if he'd be somewhat troubled by the way that America seems to glorify him.
Yeah, I suspect he'd be uncomfortable with the 30-foot monument um, in Washington. He was a humble man for all of his fame, and he didn't want the focus to be on him. He felt like sometimes it was effective to have the focus on him. But I think he'd be concerned about the watering down of his message, the way that the celebration has sort of sugar-coated his words and allowed us to focus on the parts that make us comfortable. And I think he'd be trying to make us uncomfortable.
Yes. I wonder if the glorification of his image is dependent upon the watering down of his substance, of his message.
It seems that way sometimes. That's something Harry Belafonte said to me when I interviewed him. He said that we only celebrate dead radicals in this country, and we celebrate them in a way that waters down their radical work and their radical words, and we weaken them in the process.
I think that's a wonderful note to end on. Thank you very much, Jonathan Ive,
Thank
for
you.
coming on the show.